Okay, so now let's move on to the second challenge, which is the second part of this interview. So application number 2, an API CRUD for books with Node and TypeScript. Create an endpoint to search books by author. Remember to validate the payload and handle every possible error with try-catch blocks. Now, in my opinion, this second part is a little insane. Not because it is difficult. Any backend Node.js developer should be able to solve this in no time, but mostly because first this person had to solve this to-do application, and then they had to move on to the second application under a single interview, and worst of all, they had to create the project from scratch. So if you're given 2 hours to solve this, let's say you take 40 minutes to solve the first application, you're going to be taking minimum 30 minutes setting up the application or the project for the second challenge. So if you ever encounter a situation like this, make sure to talk with your interviewer. Tell them, hey, I think this is too much for a single interview. We're going to waste a lot of time setting up the project. Then you can suggest for them to give you a cloud environment or to set up a basic project so that you can focus on the logic right away. And as the original poster said, they failed the second application because in 1 hour and 30 minutes, they only created the Express application. They were only able to configure the TypeScript compilator, configured a database with Docker, and then created one get endpoint. So for the sake of solving this challenge in this video, I'm not going to configure everything from scratch. We're going to assume you have a reasonable interviewer, which is going to scaffold the project for you. So for this, I set up a project using Nest.js, which is simply a framework for backend applications. Now don't worry if you don't know Nest.js. It really doesn't matter because this application is very basic. We're not going to be touching upon any other concepts other than allowing a consumer to make a request and the server responding back. Now, the reason why I chose Nest.js is because it's a battery-included framework. It has a lot of features natively that it would take you quite some time to set up if you were to use Express standalone. And for the purpose of, say, an interview, again, you're not going to be focusing on configuring the project. You'll just work on the business logic. Now, you can follow along if you want. You can find the repository in the description. There will be 2 branches. The first one, which is the main one, will contain the Scaffolded project without the solution. And on the other branch, you can find the solution. So let's get started. You can go to the README and you'll find all of the instructions for setting up the application. So first of all, you can run the Docker compose, and what it is going to do is initialize a Postgres database, and it is going to listen to the 5555 port. Then you can run yarn install, which is going to install all of the dependencies. Now the project has a post install script, which runs after the package is installed. And what it is going to do is simply run db code generation, which is going to generate the TypeScript types based on what it introspected from the database. And for this, we're using Kisely, which is a fully type-safe database client. So with this, all you need to do is simply run yarn run start dev. And with that, the server should be running at port 3000. Now, as for the project itself, we have this main file, which is the entry point. All we're doing is setting the global prefix to be /API. Then we load the database. Then we configure Swagger, which is the documentation for the API. And then it listens to port 3000. We also have this logger.middleware, which is simply a middleware that is going to log the responses. So we log the method, the original URL, and then the status code of the response. And finally, configuration-wise, we have this database file. All we're doing is setting this database, so at this point it is undefined, and then we have this asynchronous function, load database. We configure the database, so we pass in the connection string, which comes from your env file. So Postgres dev, then dev, so this is user, password, then the port it is listening to, and finally the name of the database. And then we simply assign it to the new Kiseli database, so we pass in the client, and we have this log. So it is simply going to log the raw SQL it is executing and how long it took in milliseconds. Now, the reason we have the separate load database function is because the environment variables will not be read until the application is running. So in other words, if we did this right away, it would fail because there's no connection string, which is this one, the database URL. So for this, I created this function, which we invoke in the main file. So once it is running, once the environment variables have been loaded, we can then initialize the database. Now, as for the logic itself, we have this books.service and books.controller. Now, if you do not know Nest.js, as I told you, don't worry, because it's actually very straightforward. In Nest.js, we have these controllers. The controllers handle the requests. So we set the endpoints, we say, hey, we want to set this books controller, so all endpoints within this controller to be prepended with /books. So this is the prefix. And then we can declare these functions or these methods. So we can say get all books, and we pass in this decorator. So we say add get, and what it is going to do is automatically map /books to the method get, this method. So if we load the Swagger documentation, as we can see, we have this get, so /API/books, get all books, which is this one that we declared. So this is the reason why I opted for using Nest.js rather than Raw Express, because all of this is handled automatically for you. You don't really need to set up anything. You just import the decorators and call it a day. Now, optionally, you can also pass a path here. So you can say /books for some reason. Now it is doubly nested. So we have books and then /books to get. So if I save this and then refresh the Swagger docs, as we can see, we get /books/books. Now, this interview challenge isn't focused on whether you know Nest.js or not. Again, we're just using Nest.js to scaffold the application and to have these endpoints up and running. But the logic itself, we can pretty much copy and paste what I'm going to solve in this challenge into Express or Fastify, and it will pretty much work. Now, what about the service? Well, I told you the controller focuses on the endpoints, so we define the endpoints, but the service is the one that actually contains the business logic. So in this case, we say this.bookservice.getAllBooks. And if I come here to the book service, which is this one, as you can see, we have this function, getAllBooks, and all we're doing is database.selectFromBooks, and then select all and .execute. As simple as that. So this is what I love about Kiseli, and that is the type safety. Remember I told you we're introspecting the database and we're generating the TypeScript types? Well, they are generated here. As we can see, Kiseli CodeGen, we import type books. As you can see, it exports these types. So books and authors. And it has author ID, type number, then created at, which is a timestamp, then ID, title, and so on and so forth. So you can ensure that whatever you're trying to query against exists. And not only that, but you're writing, again, basically raw SQL. db.selectFrom, you pass in books and then select all, which is pretty much identical to doing const test, then you say away, then you import SQL from Kiseli, and then you can say select all from books, and then .execute, and you pass in the database client. So these two are identical. And we can confirm this. If I remove this line and this one, and if I hit save and then open up my terminal and then go over to the Swagger documentation and then click here and try out, then execute, as we can see, we get all of the books. But if I go over to my terminal, this is the raw query executed. Select all from books, which is the same one you would write in raw SQL. Now for the types, you must pass in the selectable. So it extracts all of the column types. So for example, this one, generated timestamp or generated number, it is going to extract this into their underlying base type. So in this case, it is going to remove the generated generic and leave only the number type. So maybe this is the only thing that may be tedious about Kisely, and that is if you want to use the types, you must wrap them in selectable. But again, you get full type safety. And if I come here and say const response or result is equal to await this, and then if I hover over res, as we can see, this is the type. So as we can see, we can write pretty much raw SQL, but with full type safety. Okay, so now that you understand how Kisely works, I'm going to undo everything. And now we can start with the challenge. So if I come here over to the README, we have these instructions. So we have get books to list all the books in the database with optional query parameters for filtering, sorting, and pagination. So let's go one by one. We have the get books partially. We're missing the optional query parameters for filtering, sorting, and pagination. So how can we do this? How can we receive input from the request? Well, for that, we can come here and create a new file called books.dto.ts. We can declare a class, so we can say get books.dto, and we can say extends create sod.dto. We import this function, and we can import sod, so we can say z, we import z from sod, and then we can say .object, and here we can define all of the parameters. We can say offset, which is going to be a number, and we can say integer, and then we can say that it must be positive, and we can say .optional. Same with the limit. So this is for the pagination. So for example, we can limit the books we get back by setting the limit to 10. So it is only going to get the first 10 books. But then we can use the offset to create the pagination. So if you get the first 10 books, how can you get the next page, which is from row 10 to 20? Well, for that, you must pass in the offset. So you say, I want to offset by 10. Now you get the second page, and so on and so forth. And we mark them as optional, which is going to result in a type that is either number for these two or undefined. And lastly, I think we have sort. So we have query parameters, filtering, sorting, and pagination. So we can also have a filter, so we can say name, like book name, and this may be optional, and we can trim it beforehand. So we remove the trailing white space. So if we have this string, like foo, this is going to be foo like this, without the trailing white space. But we can also set a minimum. We know that realistically speaking, a book can perhaps be a minimum of 4 characters. So we can say after the trim, we can say minimum 3. So if we pass in a query name, it must be minimum 3. Although if we create a UI where you can start typing the name of a book, you want to start filtering the results. So for that, it may make sense to just set it to 1. So just to make sure that it's not an empty string, which would equate to basically every book in existence. And after this, we have the ascending or descending. So we can say order, and we can say z.enum, ascending or descending, and this will be optional. So this will result in a union. So this will be ascending or descending. Now with this, all we need to do is come here to the controller, and we can say query. We import this decorator from nest.js, and then we say query, and then we can import this DTO. So get books DTO. And if we come here and log to the console the query and hit save, then come back here and test it out once again, we get all of the books, then we come back here, and as we can see, it is an empty object because we didn't pass in any query. But let us make sure to synchronize the input with the Swagger documentation so that consumers can know what we can pass in. So we can say and then I believe it's query, or rather API query, and then you can pass in the name, the type, and whether it's required or not. So we can say limit, then the offset, we have the name, and then the order. Now, unfortunately, I believe in Swagger there's no way to provide like a union, so we must default to string. Let me check really quick if we have at least description. Yeah, so we can say ascending or descending and change this to or. Now, if I save this, it is going to refresh. And if I open the docs and then refresh, as we can see, we get these fields. So we have the order, the name, the offset, and the limit. All of these are marked as queries. So now if we click try out, we can access these inputs and we can say order by, and let's pass in something that is not valid. So ascending. And if we click execute, as we can see, we get a 400, validation failed. And we get invalid enum value, expected ascending or descending, received ascending. Now this one is undocumented. So let's make sure to add that as well. So we can say API response, then status 400 and bad request. Now if I save this, refresh, and then scroll down, as we can see, we get this one. So bad request. But what if we pass in something valid? So try out, then we can say ascending, then we can say offset at 10, then limit 30. And if I click on execute, we get a bad request, expected number, received string. Okay, so this is important, and that is queries are strings. As we can see, we have this query here, so /books, then question mark, then order is equal to ascending, and offset is equal to this, and limit is equal to this. But these ones will be received as strings, because, well, this is a string, this makes sense. So how can we parse this to a number? Well, for that, you can come here to the DTO, and sod has this great parameter, which is coerce, which is a boolean. So you can say true, and then we can say coerce true here, and if we save this, then come here and click on execute. As we can see, we get all of the books. So what sod does is it tries to coerce, so in other words, parse this string to a number. If it fails, well, it's going to say it's not of type number. If it works, we get the number back. So now if I come back here and come here to the controller and hover over query, as we can see, if I type in query dot, we get limit, and it is a number or undefined, then we get name, string or undefined, offset, and so on and so forth. Now what about the log? Well, as we can see, we get offset 10, limit 30, and order ascending. Anyway, I searched online and I did find a way to set the type for a union right here in the order property. So for that, we can get rid of the description and simply say enum, and we pass in the types, or rather the valid values. However, they are not entirely synchronized. And that is, if I come here and add something to the order property, this is still valid because, well, we're not using the schema for declaring the enum. So how can we achieve this? Well, we could export the sod schema. So we can say export get books DTO, and then we copy this whole object. And then what we can do is reference the getBooksDTO, and then we can come here to the controller and we can say getBooksDTO, we import it, and then we get the shape and then the order. Now I believe this should be returning a sod enum, as we can see here, and then we can call unwrap, and then we can get access to the enum, which is going to be an array. So as we can see, the values ascending, descending. And if we save this file and then come back here, refresh, as we can see, we get available values ascending and descending. So now if on the off chance we modify this, so we can say another value, then hit save, refresh, as we can see, it is now synchronized. Anyway, let's get rid of this one and Let's also get rid of this one since it is nested. And let me actually resize the IDE. Okay, so with this, what we can do is pass the query to the getAllBooks method. So we can come here and we can say query getBooksDTO. So this will be used as a type, so we can say type. And then for this, what we can do is use a query builder. So we can come here and say const query builder, or maybe just query, is equal to db.selectFrom. Then if I hit Control space, we get autocomplete, so we get books and authors. So we can say books, and then instead of using select all and then execute, we can, based on the query, select what we need. So we can say if query.name is different from undefined, then we can say query dot, and then, okay, so I just noticed that the mistake was naming this the same as the query. So I'm going to change this to be db query instead. And now we can change this back to query, and then we can say where, and then we can pass in name, then like, and then percentage query.name percentage. So as we can see, this is basically raw SQL. Although we're getting an error here, this should be title instead. So we should also change the DTO. And here. And this should be different from undefined. And then we can apply the same logic to anything else. So we can say if query.offset is different from undefined, then we can set the offset, then for the limit, and then ascending or descending. So we can say order by title, and then we pass in the order. Although this should be by created at. And as you can see, if I hit Control space, we get created at ascending or descending. But since we need to pass in the query.order, because it's not hard-coded, we can say comma and then the query.order. Although what we can do is actually get rid of this, and instead we can say db.query and then order by, and we can say created at and then query.order, or we can use the knowledge coalescing operator, which is if the left-hand side, so query.order, is either undefined or null, it is going to default to this value. So we can say descending, and then return db query dot, then we can say select all, and then execute. And let's see what's this error. We're not passing the query. And now if I save this and come back here, refresh, make sure everything is updated. Seems like this one is not updated. So we can change this to title. Although now that I think about it, there must be a way to get the shape and then the title here. So it's also synchronized. Maybe if we do getBooksDTO, shape, and then title. Seems like there isn't a way to get it. Although we could use description, and then here we can say title dot description, and we set the description to be title, and that way it's at least synchronized in that sense. But that could be something we could research later on. So let's leave it as title hard-coded. And now if I save this, refresh, we get the title, we can click try out, and then we can say offset 10 or just the limit and offset 2, click execute, we get all of the books, but seems like the offset and the limit is not applying. So let me come back here, and maybe the error is it needs to be reassigned. Maybe it is not actually appending them when we call where, offset, etc. Because as we can see, the return type of the where is a select query builder. So we need to change this to be let, and then in all of these, we can say db query is equal to this. And now if I save this, it should work. So execute, and as we can see, it now starts at ID 3, all the way up to ID 12. What about a title? So we can say The Hobbit. So let's just type in the, execute, and as we can see, it includes all of those that have that. What about Hobbit? Execute, we get an empty array. Okay, after spending some time, I was able to nail down the issue here. And that is, well, first of all, we were using the like operator instead of I like, which is case insensitive, meaning that it basically lowercases the two strings and then compares them. And in the other case, we weren't getting the Hobbit book because the offset was greater than the total amount of rows. So to recap, pagination works with an offset and the limit. So let's say each page consists of 10 rows. The offset must not exist or be 0, and the limit must be 10. That's how you get the first page. So offset 0 and limit 10 is equal to 1 to 10. If you want to get the second page, all you need to do is set the offset to 10. Now, what if the total count, so the amount of rows in a given table, is less than the offset? Well, you're going to get back 0 rows. So for this, what we need to do is use this select. So we can say await dbQuery.select. Then we get this option here, which is an expression builder. And then we can access fn, which is a function module that allow you to access native functions from your database driver. So in this case, we can access the count all, which is the same as doing count star. So this is the same. And then we can rename this as total count. So count star as total count. And then we can say execute take first or throw. In this case, it is never really going to throw. And then we check it against query.offset. So if this is true, that means that the total count, the total number of rows, exceeds the offset the user sent. And if this is not true, then we omit the offset altogether. And then we have the limit, and everything is the same. So with this, if I hit save, come back here and search for Hobbit, for example, we get the Hobbit. Doesn't matter if the offset is greater than the total amount of rows we get from this where clause. So with this, we get pagination even if we use a where. Now for real pagination, what you would also do is return the total amount of rows, so that the UI knows how many pages to show in the pagination controls. Anyway, with this, we have successfully implemented the first requirement, although we're missing the authors. Because if this is going to be shown in a feed where you can view all of the books in existence, you would also need to show who the author is. So for that, we need to join the books table with the authors table. Now we know it's a one-to-many, so authors can have a lot of books. But a book must have an author. It cannot be null. So for that, it's best to use inner join. So what we can do is come here and say dot inner join, and then we can say authors, and then here's the on. So on authors.id is equal to the books.author.id. And then for clarity, we can come here and say books.title, then books.created@, and I believe that's everything. And then we can say select, we can pass in an array, and then we can say books.title as book title, authors.name as author name, then books dot, then created as created. Then we can pass in the ID of the book, so books.id as book ID, and then authors.id as author ID. And if we save this and we come here and then click on execute, as we can see, we get book title, author name, created book ID, and author ID. But now we get an error because we're returning, or we're supposed to return, the selectable of books. So for this, we can come here to the DTO and we can export type, get books response is equal to, and then we can say it is going to be all of these ones. So book title, author name, string, author name string, then created at. I'm not sure if it returns the raw string or if it returns a date object. So const result. So it is indeed a date object. So we can say created at date, and then book ID and author ID. And this is an slint error, so fix. And now we can come here and we can say promise of get all books response. And we import this type. We can remove this other import, and do the same here. Get all books response. And now everything looks fine. And as we can see here, we can now get rid of Hobbit, then execute, and we get all of the books and their corresponding authors. So now with this, we have finished the first endpoint. Now let's move on to getting a book by its ID. So we can come here and we can say get, then we can say ID, and then get a book by ID, then 200 and 400, and the parameter must be of type number. And for now, let us not specify the return types. And here in the service, we can say public async get book by ID. We get an ID, and all we need to do is return select from, and we can say books, and then dot inner join with authors. So on author's ID is equal to books.author ID, and where books.id is equal to the ID that we pass in. And we can say select, and we do pretty much the same as before. So all of this, and then we can say execute, take first, or throw. And we can in fact come here, and instead of saying number, we can say export const get book by ID DTO, then ID must be positive. We export the class, and then all we need to do is get book by ID DTO, and we can remove the property. So params, and then params.id. And if we hit save, then come back here, refresh. As we can see, get book by ID, then try out. And if we send this, we get a bad request, expected number, received string. So again, we need to use coerce. So coerce true. And we also need to specify here at API param, and then we can say name and then the type, hit save, refresh this once again, and here it is. Then try out. We can say 1, execute, and we get the only book. Now we can improve the types. So we can come here over to DTO, and instead we can move this all the way up, and we can say book, and we can get rid of the array. Then we can come back here and change this to be a book from the DTO, and this will be an array. And here we can say promise of book, and the same in the controllers. So book, and here a promise of one single book entity. And with this, we get full type safety. So now with this, we can define one for creating a book. So at post, then we can say create a book, then 201 if it has been successfully created, 400 bad request, and then create book. So to create a book, what do we need? We need to pass in the title and the author ID. So for that, we can come here and we can say export const, create book DTO, then the title, trim minimum 1, and then the author ID, Since this comes from the body, we can get rid of the coerce and well, it must be positive. And then we can export the class. So now we can come here and we can say add body, then body create book DTO, and this should return a book. And then return this dot book service create book. So we can come here to the book service and we can say public async create book. We get the data, so create book DTO, and then we can say return db dot insert into, then we can say books, then values, and then here we can pass in the title and the author ID, and then we can say returning all, and then execute take first or throw. Now we're getting an error because we're not returning the corresponding author. So now we need better error handling. And that is, if we come here, we can see that we have execute take first or throw. By default, an instance of no result error is thrown. Now I'm interested in seeing what it would throw if the constraint on the author ID failed. That is, if this author ID is invalid. No author with this ID exists. Now I have no idea what it would throw in that case, although we can simply search it, Kiseli, constraint error. Okay, so I decided to use Bing AI for this. Let's see if this is true. So Bing AI says that it throws a database error and the code is this one. So this is if you try to insert a row with an invalid foreign key. Although this may not be true whatsoever. Now it seems like everything links to this main page. So maybe the links are wrong on Bing AI send. So there's no way to verify that this is true unless this article has one. So Postgres error code. So they create the enum and they set the codes. So in this case, it would be 23503. Let's see if this is true. If I come here, we are creating a book. Let's ignore this type error for now. If I try adding an author that doesn't exist, what error will I get? If I refresh this, create book, and the request body, so we must pass in the title, something, and the author ID. Let me check. We have the title and author ID. So let's say this will be 20, which does not exist. If I click execute, we get internal server error because well, it threw the error. And it says insert or update on table books violates foreign key. So let's try logging this out. We can wrap this up in a try catch, then catch error. We can log insert, then we log the error, and we can throw the error once again. And if I save this, come back here, click execute, and then check the console again, I'm not entirely sure what it is throwing. Okay, so here we have the code 23503, and that is indeed this code. So what we can do is, if error instance of database error, then we can get access to the code. So this is going to be a string. So we can say if error.code is equal to 23503, then throw new HTTP exception. We can say author does not exist, and then HTTP status dot bad request. And if not, we can just either throw the original error or we can throw an internal server error. So for this, let's just leave it as throw error for simplicity. And now if I save this, come here, execute, we now get 400, author does not exist. So everything looks to be working fine. Now we could also improve this one. what does it throw if it doesn't exist? So no result error. So in this case, we can wrap this up, then catch error, and then if error instance of no result error, then we can throw this one, book does not exist, and then throw the error. And here we need to use await. So if I save this, come back here, let's try searching for a book that does not exist. So ID 100. And as we can see, 404 book does not exist. So we can come here and we can say 404 not found. So now with this, we can come here to create book and we can get the book. So created book is equal to this. And then we can return db or await db dot select from books, and we do an inner join and we select all of this and then execute take first or throw. So if we save this, come back here, and this is for creating a book. The error should go away. Yeah, there is no error. Now we can refresh this, come here to create a book, and then we can say try out, title, test the book, and author ID, let's say 1, then execute. We get bad request for author ID. So this is camel case, not snake case. If I click execute, we now get the new book, J.K. Rowling, created at book ID and author ID. So now if we come here to get all books, try out, and then we simply execute this, we get the test book. So this is the first one because it is the newest book. Now what we can do is move the selects one chain higher, or rather lower. This way it's more close to actual SQL, since the where goes at the end or after the select usually, and the same for this one. Now there is a problem though. As we can see, we have a lot of selects that are identical, and the types are also identical. So all of these return a book, and this one returns an array of books. So how can we extract this while maintaining type safety so that we can reuse this query as many times as we want? For that, I asked Bing AI, and it says you can use the db.selectFrom, and I suppose you can use an inner join, and then you specify the select. And then for the queries themselves that you're going to be executing, you can use the dot expression, and then you can use the dot select. But I'm not entirely sure if this would work for this case, since we have all of these conditionals. Again, I have not tested this. This is the first time I run across this. But for the sake of the simplicity of this exercise, I'll not be so pedantic on this type of things. But if you want to give it a try and learn how to simplify this code, go ahead. Anyway, let's move on to deleting a book. So, public delete book, we get the ID, so type number, then promise void db.deleteFrom books.where ID is equal to the ID that we pass in, and then we use execute. Now what if the book doesn't exist? The dot execute, take first or throw. But what about the execute itself? I suppose this also throws an error. We have this delete result. But anyway, what we can do is simply say take first or throw, and we're not going to be returning anything. But we can wrap this up in a try catch, and we can say catch error, and then no result error, book does not exist, not found, otherwise we throw the actual error. And then if there is no error thrown, we will assume that it successfully deleted the book. So we can mark this as void, or actually we can mark this await, and then we can return an object saying book deleted successfully. Or we can get the ID, so const ID, and this is a sync, and we can pass in just the ID, which is going to be delete result, and this returns the number. So we can say returning, and we can get access to the book.id. So this will return an object with ID number, or we can declare it in the books.dto. So export type, delete book response, and then ID, which is a number. So we can come here and say delete book response, and we can say delete, then the ID, delete book, then status 400, 404, then API param, which is of type number, and then we can create export const delete book DTO, an ID, and then we export the class. We pass in the ID, and this will return delete book response. Now we need to set the status code. So in Nest.js, when you specify that a method or endpoint is at get, it is going to by default return a 200. If it is a post, then 201. But if it's a delete, I believe it's just 200. So for that, we need to specify that this might be 204. Now, this is not true. This will not be a status 204. And the reason is because 204 refers to no content, meaning that it returns nothing to the client. But in this case, we are returning the ID. So in this case, we should change this to 200, which is okay. But what if you wanted to change the status? Well, for that, you could say @res. Now you get the response, and this will come from Express, the type. So import response from Express. And then what you would do is pass in an object here, and you could say pass through to true. This means that you're going to let Nest.js to handle the response for you. Because if we do not set this, even if we return from this endpoint, it is not actually going to send anything back to the client. You'd have to do it like in Express. You'd have to say res.status, then 204, and then .send or .json, whatever you want. But you do not want to lose the type safety. We're stating that this returns a promise delete book response. So to achieve that, you can simply say pass through. So you're telling Nest.js, hey, handle the response for me, but let me access the response object so that we can modify it. So we can say res.status, and we can set the status, and we just return. There's no need to set the send or JSON or whatever. And this is actually in the documentation. If you come here, Nest.js status code, you come here over to the status code. As we can see, there should be a section here. So pass through, let me search for this. Maybe it was not here, but rather here. So as we can see, it says you lose compatibility with Nest features when you do this, when you take control of the response. So you can say pass through to true, and then you get access to the response. And as they state, now you can modify the status code if you wish. Okay, so this wraps up the video. I'm not going to solve this in its entirety. Why? Because this is now rudimentary. All you need to do is handle the logic and do these queries. And this is something that you can pass to, say, ChatGPT, to Copilot, to Cursor, whatever, and it is going to do it automatically for you. So now this became a somewhat tedious and repetitive task. But what we have now works as the base for everything, because we're handling the errors, we're throwing the errors, we're checking the instance of the errors, we're handling the logic, the filter, the limit, the offset, everything, which is the base for the rest of the services and the rest of the endpoints. Now, something that I want to do before ending this video is trying out something. Here we're setting the status codes like this. Sure, you might remember, hey, 204 means no content, 400 but request, and so on and so forth. But realistically speaking, numbers aren't our strong suit. That's why words exist. These are identifiers, just as this error code is an identifier. But unless you have done this 1,000 times, I doubt that you will remember what this code means. So that's why enums are so powerful. So for this, you can simply replace this to http status.ok. And this, well, since it is an enum, will resolve to this constant value of 200. So for this, you can just use Copilot to refactor this. And then you can open the chat, you can select this file, so books.controller, and you can say refactor this code to use HTTP status in all status code instances, including Swagger. Give me the refactored code in its entirety, so I can just copy and paste it here. And if I do this, as you can see, we get the whole refactored code. We can copy this and paste it here. And if I save this, refresh the Swagger docs, everything seems to be fine. 200, 400, 404, and the rest. But we need to check if the delete endpoint works. I almost forgot about that. For that, we can try it out. Then 1, execute, and we get book does not exist. What about 2? And we get back the ID 2. If I come here to get all books, try out, execute, and now it starts from 3 instead of 2. So everything is working as expected. I hope you learned a lot, and if you want to see more content like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe. See you in the next one.